Hello and welcome to this Amber and BJ webinar on how is digital assessment evolving in 2022 in association with Inspera Assessment. I'm Emily Wall, Commercial Partnerships Manager, and I'm looking forward to an hour of really interesting insight, and shortly I will hand over to our speaker Harvey Tayman to start the conversation. Before I do some housekeeping, we want the session to be as interactive as possible. So if you do have any questions, just add them to the question box for us to answer live at the end. If you miss anything, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in post-event communications and on the Amber and BJ websites within a week. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Harvey.
Thank you very much, Emily, for the warm introduction, and thank you very much for everyone for joining today. As Emily said, my name is Harvey Tayman. I am a key account manager at Inspera here in the UK. And in my role, I help customers from across different educational contexts to get the most out of digital assessment. Today, I'm going to be talking about how digital assessment, both the application of it, but then also the technology supporting it, is evolving throughout 2022. Myself, I've been involved in digital assessment now for over 6 years. And in that time, I've seen a very significant growth in the industry. I've also seen a really clear maturity of the technology available to support digital assessment too. I've also been very, very lucky to work with some of the leading lights within digital assessment innovation. So I'm going to share with you some of the insights that I have taken and I've gained from working with such innovative partners within digital assessment. The agenda for today's talk is broken down into 4 different sections. The first is to look at a brief history of digital assessment. I believe that truly to understand where we are today, it's really important to understand where the industry has come from. So we're going to have a look at some of the early applications of digital assessment technology within assessment, and also look at the growth the industry has had over the last 10 years or so. Next, really to understand where we are today, it's impossible to overlook the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had. So in this section, we'll have a deeper dive into the changes, the challenges, and the opportunities that COVID-19 has brought about within digital assessment. Third, we're going to have a look at the trends in 2022, and as I said, I'll be drawing on my expertise and the expertise of colleagues that I work with to share with you some of those trends and evolutions that I see happening within digital assessment over the next 12 months. And then finally, we're going to take a deeper dive into the benefits that a digital assessment platform can bring to you and to your institution. In today's talk, I've included a few polls for us, and this is the first one. The question which I am curious to ask first of all is, how do you currently carry out assessments within your institution? So if we can have the first poll on screen, Emily, now, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So I'll give you 30 seconds to a minute to answer this one. Excellent. So we've got a variety, which is exactly what we wanted. We've got a number of you doing pen and paper assessments, some using the VLE, and some already using a digital assessment platform. So that's good to see a good even split there. So now let's move on by looking backwards at a plotted history of digital assessment. Where did it start? Digital assessment as a concept really has been around for a long time, probably even before this timeline suggests. But in this potted history, for ease of simplification, I'm going to start us in the 1990s. The eagle-eyed amongst you will see that the timeline that you can see on screen is blank. Over the next few minutes, we'll have a look back at some of the important innovations which will help us fill out and colour out this timeline. And also, it will help us to understand the level of maturity within the technology lifecycle. Back in 2015, the technology consultancy company Gartner released a report which looked into the maturity and made some future predictions around the digital assessment market. It predicted that there would be maturity in the market by 2025. Now, usually, I take these sorts of predictions with a pinch of salt. They always come out towards the end of the year. But I must say, looking back at the Gartner 2015 report over the last 7 years, I actually think it has quite accurately reflected the development that we've seen within digital assessment. And I do actually think we are on course to reach maturity in the timescales that Gartner suggests. So let's first look at some of the really early digitizations of assessment. One of the most important first steps in digital assessment came with the emergence of the virtual learning environment, or learning management system for some of you. Virtual learning environments were developed in the 1990s, largely starting as in-house systems developed by universities before then being spun off as commercial entities sometimes when the power of these systems was recognized. Although the main focus of these platforms was to create a sort of central system which managed learning and teaching content for universities and for institutions, often arranged by module or by subject, many of these platforms included rudimentary digital assessment features such as polls or quizzes. And these features were very quickly taken up either as things like progression tests or for use in formative assessment by academics and teachers. And this, for many of you, is possibly where your first experiences of digital assessment may have taken place. At a similar time, the digitization of background processes was being investigated and implemented too. So, for example, the use of computers to automatically mark objective tests, such as MCQs, were made possible by commercially viable scanning technology. This in turn enabled educators to offer securely invigilated tests of acquired knowledge that took just a fraction of the time to mark due to this new digital technology. Whilst this was not a digital process as far as the student is concerned, it is a really important first step for digital assessment by proving that automation of previously manual tasks were possible. This leads nicely on to one of the historic innovations that I want to discuss, which is online marking. Marking for most academics that I speak to is a Marmite activity. You either love it or you hate it. But what is unquestionable is how important it is within the overall assessment process, particularly so for high stakes summative assessment, which requires vigor and accuracy in order to ensure that every student has a fair grade for their work. And so to ensure this vigor and that the accuracy is achieved, often at incredibly high volumes, requires a huge amount of resourcing from universities, from awarding bodies, and from test providers. So as a result of this challenge, educators started investing heavily into digital solutions and capabilities to help them more efficiently and effectively manage their marking sessions online. Companies were formed, products were developed all across the globe, starting really in the noughties, as different institutions adopted digital tools to manage their unique marking requirements. This was very much dovetailed by the document management industry, who were relied upon rather in order to scan the millions of examination papers generated throughout the summative assessment windows. It's fair to say that the marking or the online marking of examination papers has been adopted more heavily by awarding organisations than higher education institutions. I think this is largely due to the geographic spread and logistical challenges that awarding organisations face in running really high volume generalized testing in almost every corner of the nation. Um, Online marking, or e-marking as it's also called, by the mid to late 2010s had been adopted almost universally in the UK to manage high stakes, high volume examinations. Next, I want to move on to look at the actual digital delivery and the history of the digital delivery of assessment itself. Of course, on-screen testing has two large advantages over traditional pen and paper assessment. One is that students increasingly prefer to type and to use a computer for examinations, and have been used to using that through their teaching and learning journeys. But also, digitizing a test gives organizations the opportunity to more efficiently manage the different assessment processes, such as authoring, invigilating, and marking. The advent of digital tools such as a VLE actually gave you as institutions the ability to offer these on-screen tests really quite early on. But one of the drawbacks of this early technology was that it didn't really enable the on-screen tests to very easily replicate the standard examination conditions that we're all used to. Essentially, it was too easy to cheat. So of course, where there is a challenge, there is also an opportunity. So organizations and institutions began to invest and investigate how technology could enable the secure delivery of on-screen testing to large volumes of candidates, often at the same time. And so what we saw in around the 2010s was a couple of different methods of online test delivery starting to form. First was the use of on-screen testing carried out on site, with on-site either being a physical test center location or on a university campus, where you then have the test delivered through a computer, but invigilated face to face with a real human being in the room with the test takers. The second delivery model that we saw was the beginnings of remote examinations made possible by remote proctoring, which is the oversight of an examination remotely by a human invigilator. These new technologies were very innovative and grew in the 2010s, particularly for professional qualification bodies, such as those used for accountancy exams. But it's also important at this point to note that on-screen testing required a certain level of IT hardware and also internet connectivity in order to run them effectively. If we look across the world, there are varying degrees of digitization within assessment. One such country that adopted digital assessment early and at a very large scale was Norway. Higher education institutions such as the University of Oslo, the University of Bergen, and NTNU started working with Inspera in the early 2010s, when it became clear to them that digital assessment would offer large benefits over pen and paper examinations and assessments. What is remarkable from my perspective is then the pace at which these Norwegian institutions digitized at. You can see from the graph on screen here that in the space of just 3 to 4 years, Norway had moved from 3% to 74% of exams taking place on screen. One of the key drivers of this adoption was the student expectations. The University of Oslo found that students preferred to type examinations on the whole, and that once they had experienced it once, they then did not want to go back to pen and paper. The quote that you can see in the bottom right-hand side of the screen here from as early as 2017 was that Oslo University students had a very strong satisfaction rating with online exams through Inspera. One of the other lessons here that I think is worth us looking at is around the University of Oslo's investment in a dedicated building for online examinations. What they found back at the start of the 2010s was they did not have the facilities to manage the volume of digital examinations on site. So what they did was they used a combination of bring your own device, but also they recognized the need to invest in their on-campus facilities to augment this and to go alongside this. So I think in time for the 2015-2016 academic year, Oslo University opened a dedicated facility, which was a heavily renovated building that formed part of their existing estate in order to deliver these online exams. And the building is now a multi-use facility. It acts as an online exams hall, but it's also used for teaching, learning, and library functions at differing times of the year too. So to summarize it in terms of the history really of digital assessment, I would argue there is no real single point of origin for digital assessment, but that, like many other industries, it grew significantly from a digitisation perspective in the late 90s and early noughties. And the growth itself has been led both by improvements to the student journey, but also has been driven by efficiency that can be gained on the part of educationalists. And looking back at the Gartner report from 2015, I think that we are now actually starting to reach the end of the growth phase. And we're beginning to enter maturity of digital assessment solutions, technology and adoption. To caveat this by mature phase, I don't mean that I think innovation will plateau or decline, quite the contrary. I think what this means is that the technology is reaching a point where it's actually better serving the needs of the assessment community. So I actually think innovation will begin to flourish as the technology life cycle moves forward. So that was a look back at the history of digital assessment. Before we move on to look at the impact that the pandemic has made, I want to stop and ask for another poll. So Emily, if we could bring up the second poll, please, which is, do you plan to implement a dedicated digital assessment platform at your institution? Excellent. Thank you very much. We've got the answers in now. I think the poll itself didn't align there. It's still useful to know what forms of assessment you use at your institution. We can review those answers later on when we get to one of the next polls. So before we look at the, or rather, in order to look at the trends within 2022, I want to review the impact that the pandemic has had on digital assessment, because so much of the trends that we see are derived or shaped by the impact the pandemic has had. Whilst assessment providers were absolutely digitizing pre-pandemic, there has been a clear acceleration, which I just want to look into in a little more detail first. So what impact has the pandemic had? I think the image that you can see on screen here really does visualize, perhaps in quite a simple way, the impact has had on assessment. On the left-hand side of the screen, before the the pandemic, I'm sure we all recognise this image in terms of in-person invigilated exams in an exam hall. Of course, restrictions to in-person invigilation massively changed the way that we assess, as in-person summative examinations were largely out of the question due to public health policy implemented for the pandemic. So what we saw was a rise in digital assessments to gather the evidence of skills attainment which weren't being assessed in the usual ways. More on this this digital assessment piece later on. What people are then looking for in terms of after the pandemic, and again we'll explore this in more detail, is how to get the best of both worlds in terms of in-person versus digital as we move to a more hybrid operating model. Because of the unprecedented changes in public health policy, not being able to assess face to face, that necessitated changes to assessment. And in order for continuity, digitisation of assessments were done tactically by educators across the globe. And this resulted in some fantastic and innovative uses of technology, often implemented in a previously unheard of timescale. But what this did mean for some institutions is that the adoption was tactical. It was done in response to something rather than as part of a longer term plan. For many, this was not a problem at all. But in some areas, this meant that assessment processes were forced to change to meet the technology. And what I found is that those who best managed the shift to digital had already started to adopt, or at least planned to adopt, digital assessment at scale. So they were able to implement in a perhaps more well thought through and sustainable way. Another impact of the pandemic in terms of digital assessment has been the proliferation of remote proctoring technology. Remote proctoring was as a digital assessment capability long before the pandemic started and was slowly growing before the pandemic, but of course absolutely shot up the strategic agenda during the pandemic as a digital method to ensure those examination conditions were being met remotely. Remote proctoring has enabled institutions to continue to offer examinations digitally whilst the face-to-face invigilation has not been possible. And this has been particularly important for high-stakes summative assessments that are either ran or regulated by professional bodies. Whilst remote proctoring is not something I'm going to look at in terms of a trend for 2022, I do think it's important to recognise that institutions will now be reviewing how remote proctoring capabilities sit as part of their wider digital assessment toolkit in a hybrid learning environment going forwards. Very much to the contrary of remote proctoring was the use of open book digital examinations, which many institutions turned to as an alternative way to deliver examinations throughout the COVID period. This sort of steer into the skid approach was used by many UK higher education institutions as perhaps the simplest way to continue assessing using existing processes. Of course, the obvious drawbacks here are around the ability for candidates to use other resources online or to collaborate with one another, something which is absolutely prohibited in typical in-person examinations. Institutions got round this by flipping the weakness into a positive and by authoring examinations and assessment which tested skills such as application of knowledge or analytical skills, which sometimes even encouraged collaboration or encouraged the use of external resources. The use of open book examinations was in part something that was turned to because of the pandemic, but it is also right to say that it was a trend beforehand too. And I anticipate that many institutions will actually continue to offer open book digital examinations as a better or more appropriate test of the sorts of skills that wider society values. So now we're going to move on to actually look at the trends in 2022 themselves. You will have noticed that I used the term tactical digitisation quite consciously as a term to refer to the changes as a response of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that situation has changed, and hopefully, fingers crossed, a more stable period has now started, institutions are able to act in a more deliberate and sustainable way. And what I'm now finding when speaking to institutions is that having gotten used to digitization over the last 2 years, people are looking into how to unlock the greatest benefits of digital assessment in a more strategic way. What I mean by this is that institutions who are much more tech savvy than 2 years ago are scoping out and shaping new and improved digital processes to manage their assessment lifecycle. And for me, this is a really important shift as it helps embed change over the long term. Before moving on to any of the other trends, I wanted really to start by discussing strategic digitization first, as I think it really shapes every trend that I see in the digital assessment world in 2022. So coursework as a form of assessment is a key trend that I'm witnessing, particularly the increasingly important role that coursework is playing as a method of continuous assessment. As I say, very much I see in the market now that coursework plays a really important role. It's very much been increasing over the course of many years now, and of the institutions that I work with, often over 3/4 of their entire assessment portfolios are actually made up of coursework style assessments. I'm sure to many of you as educators and assessment experts, you won't be surprised by that. I think perhaps many people outside of education would be surprised by this. Maybe they would expect the ratio to be more like 3/4 exams or other sort of time constrained assessments. But actually, I think it just demonstrates really the power that coursework has as a form of assessment. And so why then do institutions use coursework as a form of assessment? Well, institutions are finding that coursework is actually a more innovative or more important way to assess the sorts of skills that are more important to society. And how is that? Well, the first is authenticity. Coursework is often deemed a more authentic form of assessment because it allows students to, one, use tools that they're used to as part of their studies or go on to use as part of their professional lives. And second, it also allows them to complete work in a non-time pressured environment that's perhaps then not replicated in other situations that they will then learn in. Also, coursework assignments or assessments rather are designed to test students' application of knowledge, not simply knowledge acquisition. The application of knowledge is generally seen as a more tertiary skill and is therefore valued very highly by both educators and future employers alike. Another big trend I see for 2022 is the increasingly laser focus on digital accessibility within assessment. It's a huge area of focus for educators, and it's a huge area of focus for technology providers too. The field of accessible web design offers educators the opportunity to build in adaptations to assessments in a simple and efficient way. And these adaptations allow institutions to offer the same fundamental assessments to individuals who require alterations or adaptations that had beforehand been either difficult or resource intensive to put in place. Examples of the sorts of adaptations that digital assessment platforms are able to offer include things like screen readers, text-to-speech engines, enlarged text, or different color palettes, all of which are very much difficult to replicate using a pen and paper approach. The trend towards more accessible web design is by no means only happening within assessment. What is interesting is that all technology platforms are increasingly cognizant that as our lives are carried out increasingly in the digital world, it's more important than ever that everyone has equal and fair access to the digital world. The next trend for 2022 that I want to discuss is data, because with digitization comes data and lots of it. Whilst for most people, digitization occurs because of the functional advantages and benefits that it can give. But over the last few years, people have become increasingly aware that a very useful byproduct of digitization is in the data that's generated as a result. And what I see now is an increasing trend to unlock the power stored in that data created throughout the entire assessment lifecycle. And an example of some of the more innovative applications that I have seen of data analysis and data reporting within digital assessment are things such as the ability to track the performance of question items over time, the ability to view the engagement of the student cohorts within an assessment activity, or the ability to conduct trend analysis of things like marking and grading for student cohorts or of the examiner community. And it's my view that those who can best harness this data will be best placed to improve the quality of their assessments in a sustainable, repeatable, and evidence-led way. Over the course of 2022, this is something I've already discussed a lot with educational institutions, and I expect this trend to only continue. The next trend is assessment platforms. After months and years of tactically managing through the COVID pandemic, institutions are increasingly turning to dedicated assessment platforms to manage and underpin their assessment processes and forms. Now, digital assessment platforms offer institutions a number of long-term benefits, which I'm going to look at in more detail. But first, I want to ask another poll question, if I may. And that poll question is, how do you think digital assessment platform would impact teaching and learning at your institution? You have a few moments to answer that polling question. Excellent. We have some very positive results here. Nobody thought that it would be a negative thing. So everyone was either positive or neutral about the impact that a digital assessment platform could have. So that's good. So now I want to dive in and look at how a dedicated digital assessment platform can help you. So I'm going to look now at the support for bespoke workflows that are present within a digital assessment platform. What I've learned in my time speaking to institutions is that while there is commonality in the overarching phases within the assessment lifecycle, the actual workflows and processes that institutions adopt are often subtly different. And digital assessment platforms can help you by offering specific functionality which not only digitize the delivery of the assessment, but also the underpinning work processes too. And let's have a look at an example. Something that is important to all institutions is the quality assurance of the questions and tests that are going to be delivered to students. And underpinning that quality assurance is a set of moderation or review phases aimed at ensuring that questions are only released to students when they are of sufficient quality to act as a test against a specific learning objective. And what I know right now is that many of you will manage this process using a complex set of spreadsheets and emails to talk to each other. But using a digital assessment platform, you're able to control this process in one simple user interface. And what's more, you'll have a complete audit log of the process that you can store and share with people if required, such as a regulator. So using a dedicated digital assessment platform in this way will help you to deliver more efficient and higher quality assessments to your students. Talking of students, a digital assessment platform also has a great impact here too. Last year, Inspera did a survey of around 500 different students. These students were based either in the UK or in Sweden. And the question that we asked them was, what is your preferred method of taking an exam? Nearly 80% of the students that we surveyed actually preferred taking an exam digitally to a handwritten pen and paper exam. The most common reason for this was simply that they felt that typing was a more authentic expression of their skills. Some of the particular comments were quite interesting. One was that they found the structure and formatting much easier, and they could make changes in a neater way. So things like crossing things out and writing an arrow for a paragraph to go in a different place, much more simple if you can use a word processor to move things around, copy and paste, delete in that way. The second comment, which was also quite interesting, was that many students said that they were actually quite anxious that their poor handwriting would impact a marker's evaluation of their answer. That's certainly something that I can, from personal experience, also resonate with too. But overall, we think that this is really powerful because student experience is so important to the ongoing success of an institution. And by adopting a digital assessment platform, you have a system designed to offer a user-friendly assessment experience to students at scale. Finally, a digital assessment platform offers you the opportunity to adopt truly a digital-first assessment strategy. This is achieved by ensuring that you as an institution have a range of technology tools available to enable you to offer that full range of assessment forms within your overall assessment portfolio. For example, you might want to run some tests as open book, where students are encouraged to use other resources, or you might want to run some tests as closed book, where you do not want students to access other resources or notes. You may also decide that you want some assessments to be delivered whilst digitally, but still actually on site for face-to-face invigilation. Equally, you might want some tests to be taken remotely at home. Some might be high stakes assessment, which carries credit towards a certificate or degree. Others might be low stakes assessment, which could be used to gauge a student's baseline of knowledge or to help them achieve a learning objective. But overall, our approach is to provide digital assessment tools that allow you to deliver the full suite of assessment types so that you can tailor the type of assessment to the relevant purpose or learning objective. So that was a look at some of the benefits that a digital assessment platform can provide. I now have a final poll for us. And this one is linked to or is an extension really of the last point around assessment forms, which is what form of assessment do you use at your institution? Have the final poll, please. yes, we've had this one answered already. So it's quite clear that that a number of you use, or in fact, almost everyone who voted uses a variety of coursework, open book and closed book exams, observational assessment, online quizzes. So really do have a variety of different assessment types that you use. So that's really useful to see. So thank you very much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to share my experiences and the trends that I see developing in digital assessment. I've been talking for a while now, and you may have some questions for me. We have plenty of time, so I'm happy to take questions now. If you do want to have a more detailed follow-up, then my information is on screen now. So please do get in touch. But thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Harvey. So we have had a few questions come through. So one of the questions that has been asked is, how would you like to see the business education landscape evolve over the next 10 years?
Oh, that's a huge question. How would I like to see it evolve? I would like to see, in terms of was that, Emily, business education landscape?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, well, one thing that I would like to see happen is that now there's like I say, there's a degree in terms of technological or technologically enabled learning and technologically enabled assessment. I think we've reached a point now where there is really good understanding of the sorts of benefits that it can provide. We've seen lots of early movers use digital assessment for a number of different forms of assessment now. What I'm quite interested to see now is, how can we use the technology to innovate the types of assessments that we deliver? We really cannot overstate how big of a change digitisation is. Institutions have been assessing using pen and paper for hundreds and hundreds of years, and really the process has remained very static for that time. But now we have the opportunity and the benefits that digitisation and technology bring. I think we really should harness that and use that to the best of its ability. So I'm really excited to see how assessment practitioners, educators, teachers use the technology that is now available to really innovate assessment practice over the next 10 years.
Thank you. Another question that we've had is, would you still need the proctoring tools when using a digital assessment platform for remote assessments?
That's a really good question. In terms of need, absolutely, you don't need to use remote proctoring for remote assessment, for remote examinations. It very much depends on your examination policy. If you want to ensure that you have examination conditions, so no student collaboration, no use of external resources, then remote proctoring offers you a great way to actually try to pick up on these sorts of academic malpractices whilst the student sits the test remotely. If you author the assessment in a way where those sorts of examination conditions are not necessary, you do not need to use remote proctoring. You can deliver tests just using a standard web browser. So Inspera assessment can be used for standard web browsers such as Google Chrome or Internet Explorer or Safari. Most assessment providers, digital assessment providers, will be exactly the same too. So remote proctoring is really there as a tool to help summative, high stakes assessments. Doesn't need to be used for every type of assessment that you plan to digitize.
Thank you. Another question that we have had is, how does a digital assessment platform work alongside other EdTech tools such as a VLE?
That's a very good question. So of course, in 2022, we definitely live in a world where there is a lot of different technologies, educational technologies out there for you as institutions to benefit from. which I think is a really fantastic thing. I think over the years, there has not been enough focus on how these sorts of different systems talk to each other. Certainly over the last few years, the improvements in the different systems following protocols has got much better. So from a digital assessment perspective, I would absolutely encourage integration with a digital assessment platform against something like a VLE or a student record system. What that then allows is, once you've got an integration set up with different systems within your EdTech landscape, is for efficient data flow between the different systems. I talked about the power of data. If you have integration set up between a digital assessment tool and a student record system, for example, could be a really easy way to provision your students onto tests within a digital assessment platform. So I would say that digital assessment very much sits nicely alongside your other platforms. And in order to really get the best out of digital assessment, I think an integration will save you lots of time and will help you harness the data that gets generated as a result too.
Perfect, thank you. Another question that we've had is, pre-pandemic, there was a large emphasis on lockdown browsers. That seems to have diminished as the talk volume about remote proctoring has increased. Would you advocate both, either, or one over the other?
I'd probably advocate all, and I'd probably caveat that with it's very much horses for courses. So you could decide to offer an assessment open book using no lockdown, no proctoring at all. You could decide that you want to deliver an examination using a lockdown browser, but no proctoring. So what that would mean is that students couldn't navigate away from the test player. They'd have to just start and finish the test in a completely locked down way. Equally, you could layer remote proctoring on top of a lockdown, and that's something that we see quite commonly. So you have that lockdown browser the student can't navigate away from. At the same time, they're being proctored, so the webcam could be recording them. There could be a screen recording going on at the same time as well. So there are probably 3 different delivery models that you could look at in terms of examinations. And why I think that lockdown browsers specifically would have been very much a trend before the pandemic is because they're very good for summative high stakes assessments which are delivered on site but invigilated in person. So you might be in a computer lab. You might not want students to be able to navigate away from the test, but in terms of the actual invigilation, you have someone there to of course detect cheating and to look for evidence of collusion, but also to help provide support to students as well that are struggling. So sort of summary of that question is I absolutely see there being a place for non-proctored, but also for non-proctored, non-lockdown, lockdown, no proctoring, and lockdown including proctoring. Probably those 3 different methods I think will all see a purpose in the future.
Thank you. We've also had a question asking, what developments do you see in AI assisted marketing for qualitative content, for example, essay answers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that lots of digital assessment providers are looking at. Particularly, I think what we've seen is that AI has been used quite effectively. I say AI, I think AI and machine learning are used quite interchangeably, but I think both AI and machine learning have been used very well within the sort of plagiarism and similarity detection sort of industries and solutions and capabilities. What digital assessment providers are looking at is how can AI help us to define a good answer? What are the characteristics that make up a good answer that the AI can pick up on using a huge body of evidence, but that humans are less able to sort of clearly articulate? So I think there is definitely work that could be done. I think some of the things that I already see is that sort of services such as natural language processing can already sort of evaluate the written expression of an answer. What's more difficult is layering on that expression within the context of the assessment or the assignment that it's being used on. So I think that there's clearly use of AI to automate elements of the marking process. I think we already see automation of simple objective tests. The automation of subjective tests is something that's already starting to happen, and I only see that growing over the next 5 to 10 years as technology providers get to grips with the sorts of algorithms, I suppose, that are required.
Thank you. One other question we've had is, how do institutions get started with a digital assessment platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of getting started, there's a number of different methodologies that you have, and it would very much depend on where you were as an institution for what I would recommend that you followed. One that I'd want to pick out is to do a pilot. If you have not had much experience with digital assessment before, or you wanted to get hands-on experience, a pilot's a fantastic way of getting started. You can then use the knowledge that you gain from that pilot to then help shape a future adoption, and to also evaluate that the theoretical potential benefits that it can give you do actually occur for you. So that's one way of getting started. Equally, if you're a bit more advanced in your understanding of the technologies, then there's no reason that you can't go to a larger, more big bang type adoption. That requires careful planning, but technology providers are here to help make that happen. So pilot's a great way to get started, but you can adopt at scale too.
Lovely, thank you. Another question we've had is, do you believe that the pandemic has triggered major changes in your clients' long-term strategies? And if yes, how so?
It's a very good question. What I would say is it really accelerated plans that many people already had, but perhaps they were quite a bit lower down the strategic agenda. So absolutely sped up adoption of digital assessment for a number of our clients. We had a number of clients that were doing pilots with us, who then decided to absolutely ramp up and adopt full scale as a way to meet the adoption. It was something that was already planned, but happened much quickly, more quickly than was originally envisaged. So that's definitely something that I would say has happened. In terms of how else the pandemic has influenced, I think it's also reduced barriers in that people are more used to conducting teaching and learning online. People are more used to conducting elements of their social lives online. Meeting software such as Zoom that we're all on now is very much commonplace, and so that really helps proliferate digital tools and technologies in general. And so student expectations are much higher of in terms of how much of their full educational journey they expect to have online. So it really has changed digital assessment, the pandemic, in a number of ways. It's accelerated the sort of adoption strategies that a number of the clients that I work with have. And it's also reduced the barriers in terms of people's understanding of how technology can be implemented.
Perfect, thank you. We've also had another question, which is, what do you view as being the biggest tech challenges for the coming year?
The biggest tech challenges. I think for me, the biggest, I don't know if it's challenge or opportunity, but the thing that excites me quite a lot is, how do we as technology providers surface the right data to our clients in a form that they can use to really deliver better and better assessments? One of the trends I spoke about earlier, I think if we can surface data to you in a form, in a visualization, or just in the granular level of data, you're then able to use that to do things like psychometric analysis of your assessments, to use that to do things like retiring questions when they're no longer performing as they should, detractor analysis. And I think for me, that's something that could be really powerfully applied. That those examples were related to authoring and content production. Similarly, in the grading workflow, there's other sort of benefits that harnessing data can do. So if I were to pick just one thing in terms of a technology challenge, it's how do we present the data in a form and with sort of pre-built in analysis in a way that can help you as assessment providers deliver better and better assessments long term.
Perfect. Well, thank you once again to Inspera Assessment and to our speaker, Harvey Tayman. Thank you so much for the fascinating insight. I want to thank you all for joining us and for your brilliant questions and interactions. I hope you enjoyed the session, but if you miss anything, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in the post-event communications and on the Amber and BJ websites within a week. Thank you once again, and goodbye.